you from San Antonio may have known him. He was professor emeritus at the University here in San Antonio. And he was a professor in biology. He wrote a couple of really interesting books on the early life of Texas. So he using a couple of quotes between this one here. In 1840, Francis Moore wrote, "A species of leopard is also found in the western forest. The skin of this animal is most beautifully spotted and is highly prized by the Indians as an article of ornament." In the 1840s, the western forests were about San Antonio also. So he's talking really about Texas in this state here. And the Indians indeed might be used also for the quivers, for the arrows, and they use them as trading armors, for the flaps, to ride the horses on. Another interesting, 8 years later, on Brack Road in 1848, one of the most common of the cats, Neal, the link here. I can see only what I'm talking about. So one of the most common of the cat family found in all the river valleys. I mean, that's an important phrase here. It's a beautifully spotted leopard cat whose fur makes a fine, flat, or green. They used the word leopard cat up until 1849. That's the first time someone used the word ocelot. All their early frontiersmen said leopard cat and small leopard. There's Ferdinand Neal came over from Germany to evaluate the early areas of the need for an ocelot. But then on the frontier, the early money was usually bartering and trading things. Yeah, that's a little bit better trading part. But the river bottoms, all the river bottoms, one thing we found out is ocelot really is really covered. Though you know that covered, for sure it's really covered. The primordial river bottoms, early Texas, is such a big angle of riparian vines and trees and shrubs. So that, in my mind, matches what we're talking about ocelot as well. So Del Whittaker summarizes, we have a range of the ocelot blanketing practically the whole of Texas, except the far northwest. They found it on the lower Brazos, repeatedly throughout central Texas, and north all the way to the Red River, and was apparently quite numerous in many places in this huge range. My first relative came to Texas in 1825, 2 years after Stephen of Boston and the Union came. He settled in East Texas, Atascosa. He led some successful visitors. He led the company in building development in 1826. That was the beginning of Texas as well. But I can't help believe that there was a Captain Theodore Roosevelt and his family. They saw leopard cats on the print. I'm totally sure because it was so common. And he stayed much of his life on the prairie down to the Tamaulipan that they saw him. And then they were the last part of his life and moved out here to San Antonio and considerably they had all that there as well. So we're going to go from the very early part of the also for to now really the current extreme southern tip of Texas. Maybe you can mention two tiny red dots out here at the bottom, maybe not, but that's their big population, and they reduced to this. Maybe probably less than 100 in Texas, which represents the entire population of the United States. So it is a beautiful cat. It's about a 20-pound cat. Now it's a little like a big animal, primarily nocturnal cat. And again, they eat primarily roots and grasses. So when we began the study in 1982, we really had no idea dates that are real important in this is one I want to mention. March 2nd, 1982, got the first ocelot in Cameron County. So the picture on the Colbert Ranch. And again, you could Texas history, May 2nd is March 2nd is important because back to the Independence Day. Sandy's birthday, and now it's two family coffee. So, of course, that's important to but that was, my project was about to last at that point. At the end of it. But this is their typical habitat. Really dense brush, and the densest thing that you can think of is like a wall of workers, of thorns, species of shrubs that you can think of, 30, 35 species of shrubs. And it's just like a concealment for that flying pattern. That's a perfect camouflage. As you can have an ocelot walk 5 feet into the brush and it disappears. It's amazing how it's quiet in the brush and it disappears into this. So, just when I go to the three basic problems that we currently have in this changing landscape, is loss of habitat. You have less habitat, you have fewer individuals in the population, also carrying capacity. That's very obvious in the Rio Grande Valley. This is an interesting slide. So this is where I really did the first work in the early 1980s. We trapped 10 different ocelots here. The first 2 ocelots were on the corporate ranch up here. And then I went to the refuge and studied here. And you can see all the agricultural development of the Rio Grande Delta that occurred over the past 100 years. What's interesting here is the upper part of this is agriculture. You can see unique color pattern that's here. When I was working in 1982, this pattern covered the whole valley. It was almost all agriculture at that time, with the exception of the I-83 corridor, Origin and the Brownsville. Brownsville here in the Rio Grande. So in 10 years, you can see people building houses into the agricultural farm buildings. And so the community quickly changed with time. And beginning to isolate where you lost some habitat. So this is, again, the Rio Grande, the northern part of Cameron County. So these are the small fragments of habitat that also forward. Also habitat, less carrying capacity. Habitat fragmentation results in a lot of roadkill. When you have very small fragments of habitat, the ocelots are trying to move from one spot to another to get enough habitat to live in. And in the valley, when that occurs, they cross roads. And when they cross roads, they sooner or later, it's a high density network, road network, it's almost guaranteed to be. And here's the refuge and the approaching road network that's surrounding these, and the habitat fragmentation causes this, and the species road bottom. We've got a couple of major take-up projects now that are trying to understand the relationship between these underpasses and try to protect ocelot crossing roads and reduce mortality. That's the problem you get. These are the road crews that we've had south of the United States area. And we've had many in this area entering. I call this the killing zone. If they disperse out of the refuge, it's a matter of time until we get roadkill. I think it's a great idea to put a roadkill during the movement of this ranch and other places. If we could say that in many years, maybe it will happen. You get past all the very sort of problems that we have with that. And then isolation of the habitat. So you've got loss of habitat, fragmentation of habitat, and then isolation of habitat. It's only even isolated things. We've done a fair amount of ocelot research here in Mexico. Started in the early 1990s here. Here in the Sierra Tamaulipan, we've estimated there's over 600 ocelot in one mountain range from the research that we've done here. But there's a big delta that's developed to where there's no exchange. We haven't gotten any exchange in Mexico with a good population for 40 years. And then, so that's isolation, and within Texas, you have isolation. That causes a variety including genetic problems. We've got lots of genetic variations over time. When Larry did the records that we got from Vernon Basin, some off samples from Neal, we sent some samples to Smithsonian. We went up there and 1905 genetic themselves. It's an example of the value of so the Texas population in 1905, the genetics were above 0.6 viscosity. All the samples got Mexico, which is probably almost natural, 0.7. From the mid-80s to the mid-90s to 2005, it's been a high over the population. We've documented at least 80 cases of injury going on in the small population. That's just not good for the population of future survival of the species. And then you go into this problem, talk about changing landscapes. With humans that really increase the population in some of the urban areas like the earlier Mountain Salt. And then the European Valley, that's particularly challenging here. With this population increase almost exponential. One interesting difference is that Cameron County, that's surrounding the refuge population, has really taken off in population from 250,000 to over 400,000. But the Witte, the county just opened, the surrounding ranch population hasn't experienced that. And so the bill will be talking more about the importance of these ranches, why this is important. Ranches, more population increases, some more ranches, and road up. That's really important. And then this slide here, again, I started in 1982, mostly agriculture. My 2 days of morning was modeling. Red is people and houses. This is 2016. I understand why now I've got to down to all the traffic. Look at this development that's occurred here. 2050 was projected to be this. Talk about changing landscapes. This is the changing landscape here. Surrounding the refuge population. So it's just getting worse over in this area. So we have more pieces of the puzzle together. And we understand a lot more important things like the importance of the ranch population. Most of the ranches, the small handful of ranches have most of the outside. Over 50. The refuge population, I believe, is only around 10. Only around 10 ocelots here that's being surrounded. But there are at least 50 or more in the ranch population. The problem is the past 30 years, we've had to pay attention to the ranch population. All the average of 10 ocelots down in the valley, and that has changed significantly over the regionalization. That's important progress in changing the political and the attention that needs to go into this. So that's the key. We finally have to get in the right track and asking the right questions here. So 80% of the ocelot population is on the ranch population. The ocelot is on the ranch population. So it's going to be key to the future here. And I'm here at the end. So Highway 77 is here. These are the few ranches that have ocelots, and most of them are back to the ocelots on the ranches. So a few people can do a lot of good here. So that's the end. I've got 3 more slides I want to show. I just want to thank my wife and daughter for supporting all the things I've done with traveling and that. It was happy. The same thing is that my career would have happened today. Each meeting I proved in all the past and that's and then, this is the question for Neal. This is going to be really important in future recovery. When they also continue to survive in the United States, there are a lot of challenges and a lot of loss in the growth of the recovery here. But it is going to be the answer. But it can be done. As long as you go that way, 2 things. It's going to take a lot of time. Probably beyond my like that. So I've got an 18-month-old here. And I want to figure out how my grandson can be around ocelot around 30 years. So it's like 30 years. I might still be alive all of them years to figure out when I'm still be around or not. With what you've seen right here, what's your bet on when you still have ocelot on landscape in Texas? I'm just bet that's what 30 years. How many will put money on the trail to that ocelot? No, why? Because of the landowners. Because of the landowners. Great. Great. Anybody else? Why? So, if they're good, if they're not good, if it's done without all that development, it's not good for us. Exactly. Wizard behind the screen fixes. Okay. So here's a picture of ocelot in the wild on the Ocelot land, private land. Up until just recently, we haven't had a good photo of ocelots in the wild. What really helped us document not only ocelots in the wild, but practically for the first time being able to see some of the behaviors of these animals in the wild and not being exposed to the track. So what I want to do is real quickly, from a different perspective, take a look at some of the things that Mike laid out for us, but then put it within the perspective of a new shot. What do we do now? Where do we do it? How can we get it done? So here's the situation for ocelots right now. Two little specks in South Texas, 120 miles from the nearest ocelot population. One of the strategies that they get a laws at this point has been, hey, why don't we build a land bridge from this ranch population all the way 120 miles from this population in Mexico, and maybe we can support it. We could exchange ocelots and increase ocelot population in South Texas. Okay, is that realistic? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's more realistic if we take a more intensive approach to conservation and take a look at the fact that we've got species that need to be in the emergency room, not species that we need to put in some kind of psychological therapy or anything like that. This is an emergency room situation. So here's the ranch population. Here's the Ocelot ranch. Right here. So there's the Ocelot ranch, about 27,000 acres. It's kind of the center of the ranch population. We'll talk a little bit about that ranch. Then I'm going to talk about some of these other ranches that are owned and operated by the East Foundation, formerly the East Family, and talk a little bit about the role that they can play in recovering the future of ocelot, particularly one of them. So here's what we're talking about. This cat right here in the wild in South Texas. How can we have that same species 30 years from now, 50 years from now, still wandering the grasslands of South Texas? So here's the habitat, current land cover. Basically, open grasslands is what you find with this olive color here. The ocelot habitat are these brushlands here and here. So a relatively small portion of the ranch. The good habitat is the interspersed both woodlands and Tamaulipan thornscrub. So it's a little bit of a different type of habitat than what they occupy in Mexico. But take a look at what's surrounding it. This is the developed habitat. And here's brownfield. And if you think about building that land bridge for 120 miles right about to right here to Mascot, we could do it if we got rid of brownfield first. Okay? And some money like that. We could get rid of brownfield. We could somehow restore all this agricultural ground here. And once you start talking to each other, it's a ridiculous proposition on the surface. Let's move on to a different scenario. So here's ocelot habitat.
type of brush that would contain ocelot habitat. And so there may be some potential along here, along the coast, and more areas along the coast. But there's interior parts of the species' former range where they may or may not have occupied some habitat at the time that might have some potential for the future. Just to reiterate what Mike went over on road mortality, so looking at these two major sources immediately that are threats to the survival of the species, the lack of suitable habitat and inability to connect with the population in Mexico, and rodent mortality. So just recently, from 1982 to 2020, 42 rodent mortality. Those are the rodent mortalities that we know of. Those are the ones that are found on. Okay? Now, you can imagine in rural areas out there, how many rodent mortalities happen without finding one. I think it's speculating you can double that. You can double that very easily and claim that there's somewhere between 80 to 100 rodent mortalities over that same time. So you notice where they are, a lot of them. So you have rodent mortalities where you have ocelots, right? So this is one highway, Highway 186, that goes from Rainsville out to Fort Mansfield. High rodent mortality on that highway right there. And then high rodent mortality in and around, most of the rodent mortality in and around the Laguna, Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge. So, let's move to a different consideration. Let's think long term, what might be a big risk for this species. Most of the ocelots that are there exist for 20 foot elevation. All of that ocelot habitat that we're looking at is about 20 foot elevation or below. And that's just what's left. And that's what happens when you end up reducing population from the older eggs in one basket. You get some danger. So along Witte County, right along here, there's a 3% chance every year that you get a hurricane. Okay? So that 3% chance came along in 2020. Hurricane Hannah made landfall right in the heart of ocelot habitat, passed over ocelot habitat on July 25th, 2020. It wasn't much of an effect. It's about 2.5 to 3 foot storm surge was about some kind of barrier islands. We didn't have a big impact. A little bit of blown down the road. That's about it. What would happen if 3 weeks later, or 2.5 weeks later, on August 27th, in Louisiana, thank you, Hurricane Laura made landfall and went through Lake Charles and had about a 20-foot storm surge. And you can see in blue what that storm surge did. So let's play a little mind game. What would have happened if Hurricane Hannah would have been Hurricane Laura? So just to see what we would have been up against. So there's the coast of Texas. If you put it through the National Oceanic and Administration and Atmospheric Administration's model of what happens when a hurricane hits, we took Hurricane Laura and said, put it along the path of Hurricane Hannah, and here's the type of storm surge you get. So here's ocelot, center of the universe right here for the range population. There it is for Laguna, Atascosa. Big bet is we'd have lost a lot of ocelots, maybe all of them. So this is the all your eggs in one basket. There's other threats also. This last year through fire season, we had a major fire right up here. It probably burned somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 acres of ocelot habitat, which is a lot of ocelot habitat. That's, when you think of the occupied ocelot habitat that's out there. All right, what do we do? So that's the discussion now. How about we move in? Let's move inland and move up. Let's move up about 700 foot in elevation, 63 miles inland. Let's move away from highways. Let's get real tactical here. If we could just pick ocelots up and move them, obviously we're not going to do that, just pick them up and move them. But let's take step one. Let's pick a place. We could pick the San Antonio Viejo Ranch. Here's major highways around there. Obviously, the ocelots aren't going to make their way over there on their own, traversing across that landscape, sand sheet, sand dunes, and make it 63 miles and across all these highways. But we can figure out how to get them there. So, elevation, big elevation changes, So we're out of hurricane territory. We're out of territory for road kills. We have an area that has perhaps a lot more suitable habitat. So here's the potential suitable habitat that looks like good ocelot habitat on the San Antonio Viejo Ranch. Okay, how many ocelots could be handled there? And we start to look at that. So let's just look at the southern end of that ranch, what we call the Casa Verde area, which is a big concentration of ocelot habitat. In fact, if you get out there and you bring people that know and understand ocelots, you tell them, what are you looking at? They'll tell you ocelot habitat. Okay, take the entirety of that El Sal's ranch and you could fit it right into that Casa Verde area there. It's a big opportunity there, right? From the perspective of being able to handle ocelots perhaps at some point in the future. Now what we've got to do is get ocelots. So where do we get ocelots? The potential is huge for being able to just technically create ocelots. So we are in the process right now, over the last 3 years, in our ocelot trapping. We've collected semen from all the male ocelots. Some of that has turned out to be good semen that's good for artificial insemination. Working with the zoos, the Cincinnati Zoo in particular, and some of the Pittsburgh zoos and the zoos back east, they all have what's called generic ocelots. And those female generic ocelots could be great recipients for this wild South Texas ocelot semen. And the artificial insemination that we're exploring right now for those could potentially be used to create a population of introducible ocelots. So we can take and make our own ocelots, so to speak, from what we have here in Texas. What keeps us from getting ocelots from Mexico? Right now, it's just international agreements, CITES permits, working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and working with the Mexican government. If in fact we were able to get ocelots from Mexico to reintroduce, we could either put them into a captive bred population so we could make more ocelots, or we could directly introduce them to an area like El Salvador, like San Antonio Viejo. We put them in habitat just like this. We've got large landscapes there. We've got landowners we can work with. We've got a landscape that we know that for the foreseeable future, however long perpetuity might be, is going to be held in private hands that are going to protect that habitat, and we'll be able to have this species perhaps off in the future. Now, it's a moonshot, and that's the dialogue that we are starting to have with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, starting to have that state and fish agency, that's on the wildlife department, and with everybody that thinks they have a stake in this. We are going to have that conversation. All right, there's landowners around there. Can we, is it possible to recover this species on private lands with private funds and do it in time before hurricane more on the coast of Texas, or we get a fire, or we continue to chronically lose individuals of that species in the ranch population and inhabitants and water until it's just no longer viable population. That's a conversation that we're starting to have. And Answer your questions. It's not an easy question. So the question was, how important is it to have this type of predator on the landscape?
I think all of us as Texans want to maintain our biological diversity, as much of it and for as long of it, a longer time period that we can. And predators have always been out there, and they've always been a very important part of the overall biological diversity. And to have us give up on such a beautiful predator I just can't even think about that. So the people in this room and the people we work with, we're past that question. We want the predator to be on the environment, out in the landscape. So it's important. We have lost some predators, but there's no doubt we want the more intact community to be there. Predators and prey, those things. Yes, sir.
Sorry, this is a question for Neal. Why do you think the original ocelot population died out? That's a great question. I know our family ranch, which is just south of there, introduction of all the rest of it. We didn't change that. I don't know if that's going to be we do have all the rest in some places there. Not all of that what looks first engineers are thought, this might work out and make it good, it just doesn't work. There's only one ranch in these two populations, we're not interested in the Laguna or St. Barbara. And only one ranch of all of these collection ranches adopted the state conservation, and it worked out well for that one ranch. But it's not, it hasn't happened in 40 years, so I don't know why it happened in 40 years. It's better and a lot of expense. Design this that was part of somewhere but it's not big lawn service. It's technically private land space, and only with the private landowners leaving there is going to have a chance.
We have to mention the other important date.
That the magistrate would occur on March 19, 2015. I was driving on the Ocelot ranch over in the mirror. I saw a pickup on one close behind me, so I got finally pulled over. Neal hops out of the truck and sits on the tailgate off. And he used the word, you don't mind, we got a man property. That's worth it.
I got one comment on that, just a little bit of a different view on the safe harbor. So one of the mechanisms we're working with to engineer the opportunities with private landowners is a safe harbor provision with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's and we're going through a rational approach with them, not just starting at the local level, but we're also working from Washington, D.C. down. We're trying to be not naive about the political process. And so we are working that element, and there's some policy innovations that we think can come out of the work that we're doing right now. So I don't disagree with Mike that it hasn't worked so far, but I think we're on the cusp of being able to work that out. One comment about developing this bridge amongst private lands here. We've got basically 2 million acres of the South Texas sand sheet right here. This is not a sand sheet species. And the reason that we get this type of habitat down at the bottom end of the San Antonio Diego, this is the Bordas escarpment right here. This is kind of the southern terminus. And so you'll know that well, Dr. Schmidley. This is kind of the southern terminus of the Bordas escarpment. We get a little bit of that cut up ground, and it's riparian habitat feeding down into these stream systems that ultimately go into the Rio Grande. We've got a little bit of a continental divide right here. Modest continental.
And there were also in this county, in Laredo, in the 1930s, ABC reports history off here. So there are a few there.
Yes, sir.
This is the non-scientific question, this observation. How much similarity do you think there are between Jaguar as far as the type of geological activity and both of them not, but have similarities? And then the follow-up question is, it's observational again, but there seems to be a lot more lines in South Texas these days. There are more deer. That's their primary food source. So what the deer does is increase in live population affect lots of other on the jaguar, we studied jaguar in Mexico, very hard to catch. They stop and try to get one, and then they try to catch it. But over 20 years, took a process about 21 jaguar. Right, they overlap with the ocelots in the ranch in Mexico. The difference was the ocelots stayed in the brush, and there was grass, pasture, brush, brush. Jaguar is designing them, and they use grass more. So they use more open habitat, and I wouldn't worry about jaguar in Texas that are soaking out probably on the very side of the reports of side of the state and south. So that's all it is. So jaguar off the edge trails and yeah, there's so and then on the mountain lion question, I think mountain lions generally
No, sir. Jaguarundi expert.
Okay, has there been any successful artificial insemination with Ocelot?
So we're taking success in phases. So success number one is getting viable semen, and we're finally successful at doing that so that it's not contaminated with urine. And so you got to get into the deep anatomy and everything of why electroejaculation is better than manual ejaculation and these kinds of things. You don't want me to go very much further on that. Okay. So there's some victories there in that we now have avenues for viable semen. There's been attempts at artificial insemination, none of which have yet been successful. We've got another 2 attempts this spring, and we've got a good storehouse of semen, and they're just working through the technology. And these are experienced veterinarians within the zoo community that are doing this, and so we've handed that over to them.
And I just add that the world authority of livestock semen reproduction, Dr. Bill Swanson, Cincinnati Zoo, is part of this process.
Right.
And we're cultivating this student who's working with the University of Tennessee. If it's going to happen, I can come back.
Yes, sir.
If you're able to introduce Ocelot to the San Antonio video, why is it so important to have evidence from South Texas Ocelot? Sourcing them in the generic ones.
I'm not a big judge on that because I've long proposed a more radical approach to gathering up all the generic zoo ocelots that are around North America and releasing them all in the San Antonio to see which ones supply. Now, I get shot down every time by doing that, but so I'm the same case as you.
I'll let Mike give a more reasoned, rational answer.
This may be where we disagree. I believe the importance of local adaptation with population growth that occurred in one region is significant. Deal with the prey, learn how to catch the prey in that area, to genetically predispose type of diseases, parasites, adapt to that. I testified in a court case. I can't go against this either. The Michigan court case, they wanted to remove the last podcast. And I testified the importance of it is okay. I'm going to say the importance of the evolution of these loci, collective loci in an area. The concept that's out there. Local adaptation is so important, I think, in helping wildlife in general, especially in a challenging environment. Not it's to be seen, it's to be determined. I think if we get some combination of that would also work. I think you're only going to be able to release so many generic ocelots before maybe not as much support, but it's also difficult to get wild ocelots. But there's some ideas and strategies. Maybe Mexico or Belize maybe is sort of
Sure.
it's being worked out, and by the persistence of the groups that's out and about.
And there's that full range of opinion on where we ought to get our ocelots.
I know you mentioned part of that, so like, you just mentioned the league. Are there other countries like that are people
So there's some issues with ocelots from other countries. So Brazilian ocelots, for example, continue to be owned by the government of Brazil, even though they're in zoos in the United States. So there's some opportunity for conflict there. And then whether Belize or Costa Rica or any of those other sources of ocelots would be too far removed as far as the genetic.
Yeah, well, no, there are 3 groups of ocelots, and one of them goes from Texas down to the northern part of Central America. So any ocelot from there
That's a great question. I think that's a question we'll be asking ourselves 30 years from now. But for recovery, the recovery plan, whether you would agree with it or not, for the United States population of ocelots includes 200 ocelots and several self-sustaining, whatever that would mean. That could be a loaded word, self-sustaining populations.
But what we can expect for a long time is that any one location has a larger population. Too big that population, smaller population. You get 3 or 4 or 5 populations of 30, that goes a long way.
I think our point is this is a species that's in the emergency room. And if you're in the emergency room, you take some risks and you take some actions that you wouldn't take if you were just coming into the doctor's office for a checkup. So,
And the biggest risk is going to happen. We don't do anything. That's the biggest risk.
So what do the average person do?
being ambassador for the